Good morning, all you cool cats and kittens. Happy Thursday, September 21st. You can see the agenda today. We're talking briefly about the Egyptian civilization. My guess is about 10 minutes. And then you have the rest of the day to knock out questions 17 through 22, chapter 2 reading guide. This will be on the Mesopotamian civilization of Sumer. We'll talk about the Sumerians tomorrow. Let's get into it. All right, Egyptian culture, Egyptian civilization, probably most notable is going to be their pyramids, right? I don't need to go into a lot of minutia about the pyramids. It is a pretty significant accomplishment. The fact that you got a bunch of people moving 5,000-pound blocks into place by hand is impressive. What is more impressive, though, than actually moving these blocks into place and up elevations is the fact that these things are perfectly square. The blocks themselves are perfectly square. The pyramids themselves are all perfectly square. They are done to the exact degree, which is a pretty impressive thing considering, I got a lot of golfers that need to use their phone to add up their score. The fact that these guys, this civilization is pretty advanced in their math and science and their architecture. 4,000 years ago is an impressive accomplishment. Let's get into the particulars of the civilization. Very advanced. These are some of the first people that are able to create a calendar and then understand the flaws of their calendar. We've talked about how keeping time is an important component of civilization, merely for the purpose of knowing when to plant and harvest their food. And again, if you do not have food, if you do not have a surplus, your civilization is in danger of collapsing. And again, this civilization has lasted longer than any others. I mean, we're looking at like 4,000, almost 4,000 years, which is impressive. They realized the problems with the lunar calendar, right? The moon is not on the same like 30 or 31 day cycle that we need to have a complete calendar of 365 days. Because they had a surplus of food and because they had, a division of labor, they had the best and the brightest kind of working on this. And that allowed them to make the observation that a star would produce or present itself near the beginning of the year of the Egyptian calendar. And thus they were better able to time their harvest, their harvest, their planting, and when the floods would come, so they could plant at the appropriate time. Interestingly enough, this presence of the star, the Sirius star, will become the basis of their solar calendar. And again, a lot of us think the solar calendar is based on the sun, which is a star, thus the name applies. Going on to the different components of their culture, the different classes of their culture, obviously the pharaohs were at the top, and then you had priests. For a while, the third group of people in their social spectrum, their social hierarchy, would be the scribes. The scribes played a pretty important role in Egyptian society and Egyptian civilization and the continuity and longevity of the Egyptian civilization. These were, like priests, educated people. These are people who could read, and these are people who could write. And what the pharaohs did, what the central government did, is it used these people to kind of push out and spread out this very central, uniform sense of ideology. Your book talked about how different places in Egypt had different local gods, dogs, cats, pigs, whatever. But it's these scribes that push out kind of nationalistic gods, like the sun god, right? This section of the book refers to the sun god as Amun or Amun-Ra. In previous slides, I referred to it as Aton. It's the same sun god, just a different name. But the importance of pushing out kind of a uniform nationalistic set of gods is to build connection amongst Egyptians to one another. And if people are connected to one another, there'll be less chance for division, for conflict, for war, right? If you, typically in the 21st century, people do not carry out crimes against people that they have relationships with, people that they can identify with. Not always, but typically. There's a genius strategy that pharaohs who control the government, kind of created a group of educated people to go out and spread this national identity that people could buy into. Not to mention, educated people who can read and write are excellent bookkeepers of keeping track of who lives where, what they do for a job, and whether or not they paid their taxes. And it's money that the Egyptians will also need to kind of encourage this and encourage this idea of nationalism, right? With the building of architecture, the building of pyramids, the building of temples, right? The funding of militaries, the drafting of soldiers to go out and expand Egyptian territory. Quite genius. Later on, as the Egyptian civilization modernizes, there'll be other groups of people that kind of develop within the Egyptian social structure, right? We still have the pharaohs, still have the priests, you still have the scribes, but underneath that, there'll be some middle class groups, merchants, the people who are trading goods from one country to the next. And then you'll have manufacturers, typically in textiles or metalworking, that will, establish themselves above the, lowest group, which is going to be your peasants who are typically farming. All right. Now, I mentioned those different groups, right? The pharaohs, the priests, the scribes, the merchants or traders, those who are producing textiles or metal manufactured goods, and farmers, because what will happen is anytime you have different groups of people, one group thinking they're above the other, this will bring about social conflict. And this can play a role in the political unrest that existed throughout the Egyptian civilization, where we transition from the old kingdom to the middle kingdom to the new kingdom. Those transitions were caused typically, other than perhaps the forgetting the invaders from Asia, Hyksos. Typically, it's this inter-country squabbling over power that causes these changes in government. Which brings me to my last point. Another thing synonymous with Greek civilization, or not Greek civilization, excuse me, Egyptian civilization and culture, mummification. A genius change that occurs about 2,000 years BCE. Typically, it was the pharaohs that were believed to only have an afterlife because they were so noble and so divine, godlike. They can't possibly die. They must live on forever. This changes. And again, like I said, by about 2000 BCE, everyone has an afterlife. And this change happens not out of humanity and kindness and love and, where do our loved ones go? Absolutely not. It's used as a political tool for everyone to go on to the afterlife. In our case, we would call in the Christian world, I guess, we would call it heaven. In the Egyptian case, they call it the field of reeds. This recreation of life on earth, but without death and without sickness and without hunger and without, living a life of want, this perfect utopian world. To reach that world, one must live a life of honesty and integrity and validity. Kind of like, Christians who believe you have to live this pious, loving, kind life to make it to heaven, to get through the pearly gates, right? You got to live a good Christian life. The Egyptians did the same thing. They believed the same thing. And largely it was to keep society functioning, keep society progressing, keep society peaceful. If you wanted to make it to the field of reeds, then you can kind of see it in this picture right here. This wonderful utopian society where there's ample food and a happy life. You had to earn it by being a good Egyptian, and you had to pass the judgment. The Christian world, it's the pearly gates. In Egypt, in the Egyptian culture, it was passing through the hall of truth, where your heart would be weighed against a feather, right? And the god of the dead, Osiris would determine whether or not you lived a good life. If there was anything weighing on your heart, dishonesty, gluttony, murder, right? Manipulation, your heart would be too heavy. And we can see the scales here. The heart is on this side, the feather on the other. Then your heart would be heavier than a feather and you would not make it. You were just dead. Your spirit died. You did not go on. But it's a perfect example of how religion and government can carry out the same role, keeping order in society. They believed that for the spirit to go on, the body had to be preserved. Thus, mummification happened. Again, initially only for the pharaohs, right? Initially, they were the ones deemed worthy enough to go on. But later on, about 2000 BCE, everyone suddenly gets to have an afterlife, and it's going to largely be used to make sure that society, the Egyptians as people, are doing what is expected of them while they're living. It's a nice little manipulation there of the people. Rest of the day, you've got 17 through 22, questions 17 through 22 to do for tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll talk about the Sumerians before the weekend. Hope you're all doing well. Make sure you're listening to Mr. Veith. And until I see you virtually tomorrow, go Spartans.